The old Comte de Feriol had paid 1,500 livres for her at the Avred Bazaar slave market in Constantinople when she was 4. The bill of sale was in the cabinet upstairs. On the morning of the 11th of October 1720, Mademoiselle Aïssé was 27 years old, and she had loved a knight of Malta, sworn celibate to the cross of his order, for exactly 36 hours, and she had not slept, and the small gray dawn over the Rue Neuve Saint-Augustin was the first dawn of the rest of her life. She sat at the third window of the small green drawing room with a tambour frame on her knee. The needle moved across a half-finished violet on white linen, the small, useless ornamental work the Comte was fond of seeing women do because it suggested patience. She had no patience. She had spent half the previous evening at the Maréchal de Villars' supper opposite the Chevalier d'Aidi, and the other half lying very still in the dark, listening to her own breathing, which had become something foreign to her. The Comte came down. She heard him on the stairs. He moved badly now, leaning on a Negro footman called Jasmine, who had come from the Levant in the same year she had, and was perhaps the only person in the house who remembered her as a child. The Comte came into the drawing room, and the footman bowed and went out, and the Comte lowered himself into the chair across from her, with the small grunt of a man for whom every chair had become a question. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, the way he had been looking at her for the past year, and she did not lift her eyes from the violet silk. "You wore the rose pink last night," he said. "Yes, monsieur. It is the gown I had made for you in Lyon." "Yes, monsieur." He was quiet. The fire shifted in the grate. He had ordered the rose-pink gown for her in the spring, 2,000 livres worth of Lyon silk and Alençon lace, and she had not wanted it, and she had worn it anyway, because she lived in his house, and one did not refuse the Comte de Feriol the small, visible gratitudes by which he measured his investment. He said, "The Maréchal wrote me at 5 o'clock this morning. She does not often write at 5 o'clock. She wrote to tell me that you behaved with great delicacy, and that her supper was the better for you. She mentioned that the Chevalier d'Aidi sat opposite you." The needle paused. She made it go on. She made it complete the petal of the violet flower in 2 more stitches, and only then did she lift her eyes. "He did, monsieur. They tell me he is a clever man. Knight of Malta, younger son. The brother has AD itself in Perigord. 3,000 livres of income at most, I should think. All of it from the commandery in Toulouse. He cannot marry, you understand. The cross does not permit it. I understand, monsieur. Aïssé." His old face was very still. He had a high forehead and the kind of dry, papery skin that comes to thin men in their 70s. And his eyes, when he looked at her, were the eyes of a man who had once been a French ambassador at the Sublime Porte and had brought home a child of 4 because he had not known what else to do with her. "I bought you in Constantinople for 1,500 livres. The bill of sale is in my cabinet. You owe me nothing. The code of the king makes the sale void on French soil since 1716. You have been a free woman in French law for 4 years. But you owe me, by the affection I have spent on you, the courtesy of telling me the truth. Is the Chevalier d'Aidi a question that needs to be answered?" She did not answer immediately. The fire shifted again. From the floor above, faintly, came the sound of Madame de Feriol's voice scolding a maid. Madame de Feriol was the Comte's sister-in-law, the widow of his late brother, who had inherited the running of the house from the dying old man slowly over the past 2 years, and who hated Aïssé with the patient hatred of a woman who has watched a young foreigner replace her in the affections of the only relative she had left. "I cannot tell you yet, monsieur," Aïssé said. "I do not know." He nodded. He nodded once, slowly, and then he stood up with the same small grunt, and he walked to the window with his hand on the sill, and he looked out at the carriages going by on the Rue Neuve Saint-Augustin in the thin October light. "Then come and tell me when you do." The Maréchal de Villars' supper the night before had been in the small dining room of her hotel on the Rue Saint-Honoré, the one with the painted ceiling her husband, the marshal, had had done in Italy in his last campaign, and that everyone admired and no one quite liked. There were 12 at table. The Maréchal herself, sharp-tongued and kind to women she approved of, sat at the head. The Maréchal de Berwick on her right, old Madame de Coulanges, who knew every face in Paris from the time of the old king, on her left. There was a Maréchal, Aïssé did not catch which one, and a cardinal she did know, the Cardinal de Polignac, an old acquaintance of the Comte's from the diplomatic circles of the old reign. There was Madame de Parabère, the regent's mistress of the moment, who had laughed twice at her own jokes before they began. And there was the Chevalier d'Aidi. Aïssé saw him before they sat down. He was standing near the door in conversation with the cardinal, and he was wearing the black robe of the order with the 8-pointed cross at his shoulder. And he was younger than she had expected. Not yet 30, she thought, perhaps 28. He had the long, bony face of a southerner, sun-darkened, a high, straight nose, dark eyes that looked steadily and did not flicker. He did not look like a knight. He looked like a country squire who had come to town in borrowed clothes. The Maréchal put him opposite Aïssé. The first course was a soup of capon and chestnuts. Aïssé tasted it. Across the table, the Chevalier d'Aidi tasted his and looked up. "You read Corneille, mademoiselle, I am told." "I read him as a girl, monsieur." "And not now?" "Now I read Racine." He smiled. It was a small, contained smile, more in the eyes than in the mouth. There's a kind of person who outgrows Corneille. It happens around 20, I find. You are well past it. 27, monsieur. And do you think it a question of age or of taste? Of taste, monsieur, refined by age. The Cardinal de Polignac, 2 places down, glanced across at them, and Aïssé felt the glance and made herself attend to her soup. The Chevalier d'Aidi also attended to his soup. The Maréchal was telling Berwick a story about the regent that everyone at the table had heard 6 times and that no one stopped her telling. The candles in the central candelabra were low and very steady. Aïssé could feel the wax dripping on the silver very slowly, and she could feel the dark eyes of the Chevalier d'Aidi waiting, with the polite patience of a man who has asked one question and is willing to ask another. He said, when the next course came, "You will think it odd of me to ask, but I do not know yet, monsieur. But in your reading of Racine, which of the women has stayed with you?" She looked at him. She had not expected the question. She thought about it for a moment, with the small hesitation of a person who has been asked a real question for the first time in a very long while. "Berenice," she said. He nodded. It was not a polite nod. He nodded the way a man nods when an answer has explained something to him. "Yes," he said. "I thought so." She did not ask him why. They did not speak again at table. Twice more between courses, she felt his eyes on her, and twice more, when she lifted hers, his were already returning to the cardinal or to his plate, with the unhurried courtesy of a man who has decided that the woman opposite him is not to be stared at, only watched, and only at the small intervals one was permitted to spare. At the end of the supper, the Maréchal rose, and the women went into the salon, and Aïssé walked with Madame de Coulanges, who pressed her hand and said, "My dear, you held yourself well. Your French is better than half the cardinals. Come and see me on Thursday." And Madame de Parabère, passing them, said cheerfully, "The Chevalier d'Aidi cannot marry, did you know? It is the cross. They tell me he came up from Périgord at 21 to take it, because his brother needed his portion to settle a duel. They say he wept on the day they pinned the cross on him. It was the only time anyone has seen him weep." She laughed and went on into the salon. Aïssé did not laugh. She made the small, social shape of having heard, and she sat down beside Madame de Coulanges, and she put her hands in her lap and she felt them, after a moment, begin to move against each other. The way a person who has lost a language sometimes shapes its words against her palms to remember that she still can. She knew the gesture. She had been making it since she was 4, when she had stopped speaking Turkish. Madame Calandrini was waiting for her in the carriage. Julie Calandrini was a Swiss, married to a Geneva banker who kept his Paris business in a hotel on the Rue Vivienne, and she was Aïssé's age, almost exactly, and she had been Aïssé's only intimate friend for 6 years. She had brought her own carriage that evening because the Comte's was needed by Madame de Feriol. She was sitting in the corner of the carriage with a fur tippet at her throat and a book on her knee, and when Aïssé climbed in beside her, she did not ask about the supper. She let Aïssé get her breath. The carriage moved off, swaying gently down the Rue Saint-Honoré, the wheels making the soft, unhurried sound of well-greased iron on cobbles. After a moment, Julie said, "He sat opposite you." "Yes." "And spoke to you?" "Yes." "Of what?" of Racine, of Berenice. Julie was quiet for a long time. The lanterns of the Rue Saint-Honoré went past, then the dark stretch of the Rue des Capucines, then the candlelight of a single chandler's window on the corner. Aïssé, Julie said. Don't. Do you know what the vow of the Knights of Malta is? I have heard. You have not heard. You have heard a sentence. Listen to me. They take 3 vows at 15 or 16, at the chapel of Saint-Jean-de-Latran at Malta, or at one of the priories in France. Poverty, obedience, chastity. The first 2 are softened in practice. They hold commanderies and have incomes, and they obey nobody very much. The order is not what it was. But the third is canonical. The third is taken in earnest. A knight who breaks the chastity vow does not simply lose his cross. He loses his commandery, his income, his rank in his family, and his standing in the church. There is a procedure for dispensation. It exists. It is granted to the great houses sometimes, for a younger son who unexpectedly becomes heir. The price of it for a small commander is the equivalent of his life's income. 80 has 3,000 livres a year from the commandery at Toulouse. Do you understand what I am telling you? I understand. I do not think you do. He cannot marry you. He cannot acknowledge a child. If he is honorable and you are honorable, nothing can happen between you that does not destroy you both. I am saying this to you in this carriage at midnight, because by morning it may be too late to say. Aïssé looked at her hands. Julie, she said, do you know what it is to have nothing at all? Not a name, not a country, not a tongue, not a family? I do. I have had nothing since I was 4. I have been given things, a house, a French name, a wardrobe, an education, but I have not had anything that was mine. I sat across a supper table tonight from a man who asked me a question about Racine. He asked. He did not tell. Do you understand what I am telling you? The carriage stopped at the gate of the hotel on the Rue Neuve Saint-Augustin. The footman came down with the lantern. Julie put her hand on Aïssé's briefly and did not say anything. She let her go. In her own room, Aïssé did not undress at once. She lit a single candle on the writing desk, and she went to the small painted cabinet where the Comte kept his Levantine correspondence. And from the bottom drawer she took a thin printed volume, bound in vellum, with a Latin title on the spine. It was a copy of the Statutes of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, in the 1697 edition, which the Comte had used in Constantinople when he had business with the Knights of the Maltese galleys. She knew the volume. She had dusted it twice a year for 23 years. She opened it on her knees beside the candle. The Latin she had learned from the abbé who taught her until she was 16. She turned to the section on the vows. She read it. It was as Julie had said. It was, in the careful Latin of the 17th century compiler, precisely as Julie had said. Castitas, perpetua, inviolabilis, sub poena perpetua, dispensatio sola summi pontificis. The dispensation of the sovereign pontiff alone. She read it twice. Then she closed the book and held it on her knees for a long time, and the candle on the desk shortened by half an inch, and the city outside the window made the small, distant noises of a Paris before dawn, and Aïssé did not move. When she did move, finally, it was to put the book back in its drawer. Then she stood at the window. The street was empty. There was a single watchman with a lantern at the corner of the Rue Saint-Roch. Beyond him she could see very faintly the first paleness of the eastern sky. She did not know yet, she had told the Comte. She did not know. She put her hand on her belly under the rose-pink gown. She knew. The Chevalier d'Ailly left Paris 4 days after the Maréchal's supper. He left without taking leave of anyone, except the Cardinal de Polignac, to whom he wrote a single line. I must go down to Toulouse on the commandery's accounts, and the Maréchal herself, to whom he sent a folded note by a footman at 6 in the morning, saying he had been called back to the south. Neither of these things was true. He went down to Toulouse, but he did not go down for the accounts. He went down for the statutes. He arrived at the priory of Saint-Jean-de-Latran outside Toulouse on the evening of the 17th of October, after 4 days on the post road, having changed horses twice at Limoges and once at Cahors. He had ridden one horse to the point of lameness near Brive and had paid for it out of his own pocket. The priory was an old 11th century foundation half monastic, half military, built around a square cloister of round Romanesque arches, with a stretched chapel at the eastern end and a low refectory at the west. The old bailey of the priory, who was then commander of the priory, received him in the small office off the cloister at 10 at night, with 2 candles burning on the desk and a bottle of unwatered red wine that the bailey had been drinking by himself. "You are not expected, Aïssé." "I know, monseigneur. And you have ridden very hard." "Yes, monseigneur." The bailey was 70. He had served at Vienna against the Turks under Sobieski as a young commander, and he had taken 3 balls in his right hip at Belgrade in '88, and he walked with a stick and a leaning gait. He had known Aïssé's brother before Aïssé himself, and he had pinned the cross on Aïssé when the boy was 16 in this same cloister. He looked at the man across the desk for some time before he said anything more. "Sit down." Aïssé sat. "Now," the bailey said, "tell me what brings you to this house at 10 o'clock on the 17th of October with a horse foundered at Brive." Aïssé said, "I would like to read the statutes on the 3rd vow, monseigneur, the full text, and I would like to know what the rate of the dispensatio matrimonialis has been in the last 20 years for a commander of the smaller revenue." The bailey was very quiet. After a moment, he stood up and walked across the room with his stick to a tall cabinet of black oak, unlocked it with a key on a chain at his belt, and brought back a volume which Aïssé recognized at once. It was the 1697 edition of the statutes, in vellum, the same volume that Aïssé in Paris had taken out of a drawer at 3 in the morning and read in her own bedroom by a single candle. The bailey put it on the desk between them and opened it to the section on the vows. "Read it, my son." Aïssé read it. "And the dispensations?" The bailey closed his eyes briefly. "In the last 20 years, he said, I know of 7 granted by the Holy See on petition of a French commander. 6 were for younger sons who unexpectedly became heirs to a great house, where the family could pay. The 7th was the son of a Maréchal of France, in 1712, who became the only male of the line on the death of 2 cousins in the war. In each of these 7 cases, the dispensation was granted on payment of a sum equivalent to 30 years of the petitioner's commandarial income. 30 years, Aïssé. In your case, that is 90,000 livres. The order does not negotiate." Aïssé said nothing. "Now you will tell me," the bailey said, "why you have come." The bailey's eyes were still closed. He had not opened them when he spoke. He was a man who had spent his life adjudicating between God and other people's desires, and he had learned that closed eyes made the conversation honorable. Aïssé said, "She is 27. She was taken in Constantinople at 4 and brought to France by Ferial. She is free under the king's ordinance. She reads Racine. She has carried herself for 23 years in a house that bought her, with the steadiness of a person who knows it. She came to a supper at the Villers, sat opposite me, told me she preferred Berenice to all the other Racine women. I asked her, Monseigneur, because I knew before she answered. There has been no offense between us. There is no child. There is no situation. I am asking, while there is yet time to ask, whether it is possible that the order would let me leave the cross with my honor intact and marry her in a chapel before the year is out." The bailey opened his eyes. He looked at Aïssé for a long time, and then he reached across the desk and poured Aïssé a glass of the unwatered red wine and slid it across to him. And Aïssé took it with hands he was making steady by will and drank half of it without tasting it. "My son," the bailey said, "listen to me. I have known you a dozen years. I have watched you carry the cross with the kind of honest patience that this order does not often see in its smaller commanders. If you ask me to put it to the general chapter at Malta, I will. I will write the petition tomorrow morning with my own hand. The petition will be denied. The chapter is sitting under Grand Master Zondadari, who is not a man inclined to the dispensation of vows for younger sons of small French houses. The petition would take 11 months to be heard. While it is heard, you would not be permitted to leave the priory grounds. The denial would arrive in the September of next year. By that time, your young lady would have been waiting 12 months without the protection of either marriage or the public knowledge of an honorable engagement. And you would, when the denial came, be left with 2 choices: to apostatize, which means to lose the commandery, the income, You're standing in the ID family, and, you will forgive an old man for saying this, your remaining personal honor, or to submit to the denial and end the matter. There is no third path, my son. I have looked. For 40 years I have looked. There is no third path. Aïssé set the glass down. He looked at his own hands. And what would you do, Monseigneur? The Bailli took a long breath in through his nose. I do not know, Aïssé. I am 71. I have not loved a woman in 43 years, and the woman I loved at 28 was the daughter of a Bordeaux wine merchant who married someone else and died at 31 and is buried at Saint-Cyrin. I do not know what I would do in your place. I will tell you what I would not do. I would not ride down here at night and ask the Bailli for the impossible, and then ride back to Paris and behave as though the answer were uncertain. I would not deceive her by a hope I had been told was not there. No, Monseigneur. Will you ride back? I will ride back. I will tell her. And then, Aïssé did not answer. The Bailli closed the volume and set it on the corner of the desk and stood up with the help of his stick. Stay the night here, my son. The infirmarius will give you a bed. Eat a hot meal in the refectory at 6 in the morning. Then go back to Paris. Go honorably. Whatever the two of you decide, decide it knowing what the statutes say. That is the most a Bailli of this order can give you. The rest is between you, her, and a God who, in my private view, is more merciful than the general chapter. Aïssé stood and bowed and went out into the cloister. He did not sleep. He sat on a bench under the round arches and looked at the moonlight on the parquet floor of the chapel, which he could see through the open door, and he waited for the night to end. In Paris, in the same week, Aïssé sat down at the bureau in her bedroom on the Rue Neuve Saint-Augustin and began the letter she had been turning over in her mouth for 3 days. The letter went to Julie Calandrini in Geneva, because Julie had returned with her husband the week after the Maréchal's supper to attend to the autumn settling of his Paris correspondences from the Geneva office. The letter was the kind of letter that two women who have been close for 6 years write to each other when one of them has reached a place she cannot otherwise speak from. Aïssé did not begin it directly. She began it where it would let her come up to the thing slowly, the way a person walks a horse up to a difficult jump. She wrote about her childhood first. She wrote it because Julie had asked her about it twice in the carriage on the way back from the Villars' supper, and Aïssé had each time changed the subject. And now Aïssé felt she owed Julie the answer, and she also felt she owed herself the answer. She wrote, My memory of Constantinople begins, I think, when I was 3. There is a courtyard with a pomegranate tree, and there is a woman in a yellow headcloth, who I believe was my mother. And there is a sound which I have not heard since, which was perhaps the muezzin of the small mosque at the end of our street. I do not know what street. I do not know what mosque. There was a brother. He was older than I was. I think he was 8. He was taken away first, by men in dark robes, and I never saw him again. And I do not know whether the men were janissaries on a sweep, or whether they were slavers and the janissaries were on the other side of the courtyard wall. There were sounds. I will not write what the sounds were. After the sounds, I was in a small wooden room with 3 other little girls. And I think this was somewhere by the harbor, because I could smell tar, and I could feel the room moving slightly. And I think we were in a boat that did not go anywhere, only sat tied at a pier for some days. I was 4. The Comte de Feriol bought 4 of us from the dealer at the slave market of Avret Bazaar for the sum of, I have seen the bill of sale, 1,500 livres each, which was the price of an educated girl child of evident health. 3 of the 4 were Greek. I, by what was apparently my dress and my features, was understood to be a Circassian, though I do not know what I was, because by the time I could ask the question there was no one to ask. She paused at this point. She put the pen down and made herself drink a glass of the small Madeira the Comte kept on the side table, and then she went back to the desk. What I would have you understand, Julie, is that the Comte who bought me was not the man who sold me. The Comte brought me to France in 1798. I'm writing the date wrong, in 98 that is, 698. I am tired and I have lost 20 years. The Comte brought me to France in 98, when I was 4. He gave me to his sister-in-law, who refused to keep me. He gave me to a convent at Auteuil for a year, where the sisters taught me French and the catechism and were kind to me. He took me back into the hotel on the Rue Neuve Saint-Augustin in 1700, when I was 6. From then, he kept me himself. He had an abbé brought from Lyon to teach me Latin and Italian and the catechism more deeply. He himself taught me to read Racine and Boileau. He had me dressed by the same dressmaker who dressed his sister-in-law's daughter. He sat me at dinner at the small, private table when there were no guests. He never, Julie, I write this because the question is what it always is, never touched me with anything but the touch of a man who has bought a child by mistake and has decided to raise her honorably. I am 27 now, and I am telling you that there was never anything in that house that I had to forgive him. Madame de Ferriol, that is, the late brother's widow, the one who runs the housekeeping now, that is another matter. She has hated me since I came back from the convent. She hated me because the Comte was 20,000 livres a year poorer, after the Levantine debts, than her own husband had been. And her husband had been a younger brother, and she felt the cadet line had earned the seniority of the household. When I appeared and the Comte gave me the small green drawing room as my own, she understood at once that I had displaced her daughter. The daughter was placed in a convent in Senlis, and Madame de Ferriol settled into the hatred, and has not moved from it since. The Comte is failing. He has not been on the staircase without Jasmine in 2 years. He is 73. When he goes, and Julie he will go, by the spring, the Dr. Bouvard from the Rue des Bons Enfants has said so to me directly, because he is an honorable man and he knows my position. The hotel passes to Madame de Ferriol. I will have no place in it. My salary from the Comte is 1,000 livres a year, settled by his late will in 1717. There is a small annuity of 400 for life, on the death of the Comte. That is what I will have to live on. The Comte's books, his books only, he has settled on me. 500 volumes, which would sell for perhaps 2,000 livres if sold properly. Madame de Ferriol will, by what I understand of her character, attempt to break the will at the Châtelet on the ground of mental incapacity. The Abbé Dubreuil has told me she has already spoken to her notary. That is my situation. Now I must come to the part which you know. He came back to me in the Rue Vivienne, at your husband's hotel. You yourself were at Geneva, on Tuesday afternoon. He had written from Toulouse. He had written from a priory called Saint-Jean-de-Latran, outside Toulouse, where he had asked the old bailli of the priory who had pinned the cross on him at 16 what the rate of the dispensation was for a commander of 3,000 livres. The rate is 90,000. The petition would take 11 months. The petition would be denied. Julie, he came back to me to tell me this himself. He came back to me because the bailli told him to come back honorably and tell me himself. He told me. He stood in your husband's outer office in his traveling cloak, with the cross at his shoulder, and he told me. I sat in the small chair beside the writing desk and listened. And when he was done, I asked him a question. I asked him what he would do. He said, "Whatever you ask me to do, I will do. If you ask me to apostatize, I will. If you ask me to ride away tonight and never come back, I will." I did not answer. I went and stood at the window. He waited. He waited a quarter of an hour. I came back from the window and I asked him another question. I asked him whether he loved the cross. He said, "I love the men who wear it. I do not love the cross. The cross is a piece of metal." I said, "And the chastity?" He said, "Aïssé. The chastity I made at 16 because my brother needed my portion. I did not understand at 16 what I was promising. I think now that I would not have promised it. But I did promise it. And I have kept it for a dozen years. And I have kept it because the breaking of it was not worth what it would have cost. Now the breaking of it appears to be worth it. I do not know whether that is honor or whether it is desire. I am not sure I have ever known how to tell those two apart." I said, "Will you then ride away and never come back if I ask you?" He looked at me. He looked at me, Julie, the way a man looks who has waited 4 days on the post road from Toulouse for the answer, and who has now been told that the answer might still be the one he most feared. He said, "Yes." I did not ask him to. I had not, you understand, made any decision before he came. I had read the statutes on the night of the supper, in the bedroom, in the candlelight, the same statutes he was reading 2 days later at Saint-Jean-de-Latran. I had understood what the statute said. I had not, however, understood that he had understood as well. I had not understood that he had ridden 4 days into the autumn rain to put the question to the Bailey and ride back with the honest answer in his pocket. That was the thing that decided me. If a man has ridden 4 days for nothing, Julie, you do not send him away with a fifth. I will not write what we did. You know what we did. We have been 3 times together since. Twice at your husband's hotel, because the Rue Vivienne is the only house in Paris where I am received without a ferryall watching me, and once at the small house in Auteuil that he has rented for the winter under the name of a clerk in the War Ministry whom he knows. I have been careful. He has been careful. The Comte does not yet suspect. Madame de Ferriol does not yet suspect. The Dr. Bouvard does not yet suspect. I think I am with child. I think I have been with child for 6 weeks. I do not yet know what I will do. Julie, you are the only person to whom I have written this sentence. Burn the letter when you have read it. Write to me at the Comte's house under your husband's seal, as before. Tell me what to do. She did not, of course, mean, tell me what to do. She meant, tell me that there is a way to do what I am about to do. She sealed the letter with her own seal, the small oval of a pomegranate that the Comte had had cut for her in Marseille when she was 11, because the pomegranate was the first tree she remembered. She gave it to Jasmine to take to the post. Jasmine took it without looking at her, the way Jasmine had been taking everything she sent for 23 years. That evening at supper, she sat across from the Comte and Madame de Ferriol in the small dining room and ate a partridge she did not taste. And the Comte asked her once if she was well, and she said she was tired. And he said, "You have been tired since the Villers' supper, my dear. I hope you will rest." And she said, "Yes, monsieur." Madame de Ferriol did not speak. Madame de Ferriol watched her cut her partridge with the patient, steady attention of a woman who has been waiting for 3 weeks for a particular thing to become visible. When Aïssé rose from the table, she felt the room go briefly gray at the edges, and she put her hand on the back of the chair to steady herself, and she made the social movement of having needed only to smooth a fold of her skirt. The Comte did not see. The Comte had been looking at the candle. Madame de Ferriol saw. Madame de Ferriol saw, and Madame de Ferriol did not say anything yet. Madame de Ferriol smiled, very slightly, and reached for her glass. Madame de Ferriol came into the small green drawing room on the morning of the 11th of February in the year 1721 without knocking, and she shut the door behind her, and she stood with her back against it. "Take off your shawl." Aïssé set the book she had been not reading on the side table beside her chair, and she looked up. The book was Madame de Sévigné's letters in the Pelisson edition. The shawl was a long indoor wrap of gray wool. She had been sitting in it for an hour because she was cold, or believed she was cold. She had also been sitting in it because it covered her belly. "Madame," I said, "take off your shawl, mademoiselle. You will do it now, or I shall send for Mariette and have her do it." Aïssé took off the shawl. She folded it and put it across the arm of the chair. She did not stand up. She did not look down. She lifted her face and met the eyes of the Comte's sister-in-law and waited. Madame de Ferriol stood by the door for the better part of a minute and looked at Aïssé's gown. The gown was a winter morning robe of the simplest kind, dark gray wool with a fichu of plain linen at the bosom and a sash of gray ribbon at the waist. The sash had been tied higher than the waist. The fichu had been folded in such a way as to bulk the bosom out forward. The combination of these arrangements, in a gown which was already meant to drape rather than fit, had concealed for nearly 4 months a thing that on Aïssé's frame, slight and short-waisted as she was, would by any other woman of the household have been observed in 3. Madame de Ferriol had observed it 3 weeks ago. Madame de Ferriol had not been certain. She had spoken to Mariette, the upper chambermaid, on the morning of the 8th of February, and Mariette had wept, and Mariette had told her. Mariette was not the kind of upper chambermaid who, having taken an oath to her young lady, kept it under questioning from the mistress of the house. "Stand up, Aïssé." Aïssé stood up. She did not put a hand to her belly. She did not move the fichu. She stood with her hands at her sides and let Madame de Ferriol look, because by now there was nothing to look at that the eye had not already seen. Madame de Ferriol said, 5 months. "Yes, madame." The Chevalier d'Adi. "Yes, madame." Of the Order of Malta. Yes, madam. Sit down. Aïssé sat down. Madame de Ferriol came across the room. She walked slowly and not without a small theatrical pleasure at the slowness. She sat down opposite Aïssé in the Comte's own armchair, the one that had been reupholstered at considerable expense by the same Lyon upholsterer who had made the Comte's bed curtains. And she settled her skirts and folded her hands in her lap and did not speak for a long moment. And only after the moment was full did she say, "I will not tell my brother-in-law." Aïssé did not let her face change. "My brother-in-law is dying, mademoiselle. The Dr. Bouvard told me on the 2nd of February that the Comte has, in his estimation, between 5 and 10 weeks. I will not have my brother-in-law die in the knowledge that his charity girl, his redeemed Levantine, his pomegranate seal, is carrying a Knight of Malta's bastard in his own hotel. I will not. Whatever you and I may say to one another, that we shall agree on. He will go to his God without this. Yes, madame. Now, you will leave this house, mademoiselle, within the week. You will not return to it. You will pack the trunk that you brought from the convent at Auteuil when you were 6, no more, no less. The books my brother-in-law gave you will be sent on later in accordance with his will, if the will stands. You will write a letter to my brother-in-law saying that you have been called to the bedside of a sick friend at Sens. The letter will be on his pillow this evening. He will believe it. He will not be well enough to question it. I will tell him for the rest of his life, which again will be between 5 and 10 weeks, that you write often and well from the country, and that you ask after him daily. When he goes, mademoiselle, I will write to you wherever you are, and you will not come back for the funeral. You will not appear in this house again. Is this clear to you? Yes, madame. You will go to my cousin's convent at Jonzac in the Saintonge. They take cases of this kind discreetly and at a fixed scale of charge, which I shall pay out of the household account against my brother-in-law's estate, on the understanding that you will not, by any communication whatever, attempt to bring legal claim of any kind against that estate after his death. The convent is 60 leagues from Paris on the Bordeaux road. The journey is 6 days at this season. I shall send Jasmine with you, because Jasmine will return alone, and because Jasmine will not speak. The child will be born at the convent in late May or early June. The sisters will place the child in an orphanage at La Rochelle. You will return, if you wish to, and I do not, mademoiselle, recommend that you do, to a city of your choosing which is not Paris. There are positions for educated women in Geneva. Your friend Madame Calandrini is doubtless willing to assist. She paused. That is the arrangement. Aïssé sat with her hands folded. She said, Madame, I will accept the convent. I will not accept La Rochelle. Madame de Ferriol's eyebrows lifted very slightly. You will not? No, madame. You believe yourself to be in a position to refuse a term. I believe myself to be in a position to refuse one term, madame. The child will not go to La Rochelle. The child will be placed where I choose. And where, said Madame de Ferriol, in the small, dry tone of a woman amused by an unexpected impertinence, would you choose? With friends in England, madame. Friends of Madame Calandrini. They have been written to. They will travel to Calais in the 2nd week of June to receive the child. Madame de Ferriol looked at her for a long time. The look was that of a woman who has been outflanked at one small point in the maneuver that she had otherwise believed entirely under her control, and who is recalculating the cost of insisting on the original term against the cost of permitting the variation. Friends of Madame Calandrini, she said. Yes, madame. Protestants, no doubt. Yes, madame. The mother is the wife of an English statesman exiled in France for the past 6 years. They have no children. They are honorable people. They have asked for, by family tradition, a child of educated parents. Honorable people, said Madame de Ferriol, do not as a rule receive the bastards of women they have never met. Madame Calandrini has known the wife for 9 years. Madame de Ferriol thought about it. She thought about it for the better part of 2 minutes, in the small drawing room with the green silk damask walls, while the fire shifted in the grate and Aïssé sat folded in her chair and did not look down. Eventually, Madame de Ferriol stood up. She smoothed her skirt. Very well, the convent will release the child to a person designated by you, at Calais, in the 2nd week of June. You will not, however, accompany the child to Calais. You will remain in the Saintonge for a further 3 months after the birth, to recover, at the convent's hospice, and at the cost of the household, mademoiselle, on the same understanding as before. You will return to Paris only by my consent. Yes, madame. And one more thing. Madame de Ferriol stopped at the door. You will not see the Chevalier d'Ailly before you go. You will not write to him from the road. You will write to him only after the child has been placed, from wherever you choose to settle, and not before. If you write to him before, mademoiselle, by the soul of the convent porter at Jonzac, whom I shall be paying to read every letter you set down, I shall produce in the matter of the Comte's will an additional codicil, which the Dr. Bouvard will be persuaded to witness, and you will receive, of the 400 livres of annuity for your life, the precise sum of nothing. Is this clear to you? Yes, madame. Madame de Ferriol nodded once. She opened the door. She paused on the threshold and looked back, and she said, with a small surprising tone, Your child, mademoiselle, will be raised in better circumstances than the convent at Jonzac could have arranged. That is at least one act of providence in a household which has otherwise been entirely without it. Good morning. She went out and shut the door. Aïssé did not move for some time. Then she put her hand under her fichu and laid it flat against her belly, and the child, which had not been moving for some minutes, moved against her palm, and she held it there. Chevalier d'Ailly was waiting in the small house at Auteuil. The house was a low cottage of plastered brick that he had taken in November under the borrowed name of Monsieur Lambert, clerk in the War Ministry. The cottage stood at the end of a lane behind the old church and had a kitchen, a parlor, and one upstairs bedroom with a view of an orchard. He had stocked it modestly, a small chest of his own traveling clothes, 6 books, a chess set, 3 bottles of an unpretentious Saumur, a brass-bound writing case. He had told the elderly housekeeper from the next farm that his wife came down from Paris on Wednesdays, and that the household account would be settled on the 1st of every month, and that he wished, above all things, not to be disturbed. She came down on the morning of the 13th of February by a hired chaise from the Rue Saint-Honoré, with a small portmanteau of her things. She would in 2 days set out on the Bordeaux road in the Comte's heavy traveling carriage with Jasmine and 2 boxes of linen. The 2 days at Auteuil between now and that departure were the days they had been permitted. They had been permitted them by the willing dissimulation of Julie Calandrini, who had told Madame de Ferriol that Aïssé was lodging at the Rue Vivienne until the carriage was made ready. Aïssé met her at the lane. He took the portmanteau. He did not speak. He brought her into the parlor where the fire was lit, and the small gray cat that the housekeeper had let in was asleep on a footstool. And he set down the portmanteau by the door, and he turned to her, and she went into his arms and stayed there for what was, she thought afterwards, the better part of a quarter of an hour, neither of them speaking. Then he said, Tell me. She told him. She told him sitting in the parlor chair with his hands on hers. She told him about Madame de Ferriol's entrance into the green drawing-room without knocking, about the shawl, about Mariette, about the convent at Jonzac, about the Dr. Bouvard's estimate of 5 to 10 weeks for the Comte. She told him about the agreement on the English placement of the child. She told him about the codicil that would be produced by the doctor if she wrote to him before the placement was made. She did not tell him about the precise sum of nothing. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she had finished, he stood up. He walked to the small window of the parlor. He stood there with his hand on the sill, and after a moment he said, Aïssé. Yes, I will leave the order this afternoon. We will be married before the parish priest of Auteuil. He is a friend of the housekeeper's. He will do it on a private dispensation of consanguinity. No banns, within the week. I will write to my brother in Périgord and ask for the use of the small farmhouse at Marsac, which he will give me. We will live there. The child will not go to Calais. You will not go to the Saintonge. I will lose the cross, the commandery, the income, the standing in the family, and the standing in the church. I have been thinking about it on the road from Toulouse, and again in this cottage every night since November. I have decided. I am telling you now what I have decided. She did not answer at once. She got up. She walked to the window. She stood beside him. She did not touch him. She said, Tell me, monsieur, what is the income of the small farmhouse at Marsac? He said, 600 livres a year. The vines do not do well in years of late frost, But the last 3 years have been good. In the courts of Périgord, monsieur. If your brother dies, when your brother dies, since he is older than you by 29 years, to whom does the estate go? He was quiet. To my brother's son, to my nephew Antoine, who is 12. And after Antoine? If Antoine dies childless, to me. But Antoine, mademoiselle, will not die childless. Antoine is 12, healthy, betrothed already to a cousin of his mother's. There will be sons, so there is no estate to inherit. There is no estate to inherit. And the commandery at Toulouse, if you give it up, will go to whom? To the order. The order assigns it. It will be assigned to a younger son of the de Sade family, who has been on the waiting list since 1716. 600 livres a year, then, monsieur, in a farmhouse in Périgord, with the family unable to receive us, and the church having put you under interdict, and the order having struck your name from the list of commanders, and your name being thereafter a thing your brother does not speak in the company of his wife. That is what you propose. He did not answer. Listen to me, she said. I am asking you to listen to me with the same patience you have shown me since the Maréchal's supper. I have thought about this since the 11th of October. I have thought about it every night and every morning. I have thought about it during the 4 months in which I have known about the child, which I knew about, monsieur, before you knew, and I have not told you, because I needed to think clearly first. Listen, he said, I am listening. You took the cross at 16 because your brother needed your portion to settle a duel. He had killed the second son of the Marquis de Caumont over a quarrel in which he was, by your own telling of the story to me at Auteuil last December, in the wrong. The cost of the settlement was a mass for the dead Caumont son in perpetuity in the chapel of the Caumont Château, and the dowry of the Caumont daughter, who would otherwise have had to be sent to the convent because her own portion had been spent on the duel. Your portion was 26,000 livres of inheritance. You gave it. You gave it because your brother had killed a man, and a girl was about to be locked up for it, and there was no other money in the family. You did the honorable thing. You have spent a dozen years standing by the honorable thing. You have not regretted it once. You told me that in the carriage from the Comédie Française on the 3rd of January. You did not regret it once. No. Now, you will tell me, monsieur, what changes between October and February in your honor? That you regretted nothing in a dozen years, and you now propose to break a vow you took freely. Tell me what changes. He said after a moment, You change. That is not enough. It is enough for me, she said. It is not enough for me. Listen, monsieur, I will not be the woman for whom you broke the vow you kept for a dozen years. I will not be the figure in the corner of the portrait of your life on whom your nephew Antoine, at 60, in the family salon at 80, will look and say, My uncle threw away the cross for that one. I will not be that woman. I will not be that woman because I cannot bear it. And I cannot bear it because I have spent 23 years being the figure in the corner of someone else's portrait, monsieur. Yours is the first house I will not be in the corner of. So I will not go into that corner with the small placard that says, She made him give up the cross. Listen, I am listening. The child will go to England. The child will go to a Protestant household in which the husband is exiled from England for being on the wrong side of the succession of 1715, and the wife is a Frenchwoman who has been refused children by God and has been writing to Julie Calandrini for 2 years asking for one. The child will be raised in a house with a library and a garden and a good Anglican education and a small sum of money in trust against her majority. The child will not know me. The child will not, until she is of age and her foster mother decides, know who her mother is. The child will not bear our names. I am asking you not to break the vow. I am asking you to keep it. I am asking you to keep it, and to keep the commandery, and to keep the 3,000 livres, and to use that income to support me at a small house in a town of my own choosing, a town which is not Paris, for the rest of my life, which I do not think will be long. The Dr. Bouvard told me on the 2nd of February that my chest is, by his estimation, already affected. I had not told you. You may say what you wish about my honor in not telling you. The fact is the fact. I do not think I have 10 years. I think I have 5. I think I have less. Aïssé, hush, hear me. I will not be the woman who took the cross from your shoulders. I love you in a way that does not permit it. Do you understand me? He understood her. He understood her with such a stillness that the small gray cat by the fire lifted its head and watched him. She said, I am asking you to keep the cross because I am asking you to keep the man who took it. Whatever I would do with the man you became after giving it up, and I would, monsieur, perhaps I would. Perhaps you would be a better man, perhaps a worse, but he would not be the same. Whatever I would do with him would be one form of robbery upon another. I am tired of the figure of the robber. The Comte bought me at 4. Fariol himself, who I do not blame, bought me for the very small sum of 1,500 livres, which the dealer at Havre Bazaar had asked for me on a Tuesday morning in 1798. There, I have done it again, I cannot stop. 698. The Comte bought me for 1,500 livres in the year of our Lord 1698. He bought me. He did the honorable thing afterwards with what he had bought, but he bought me. I have lived 23 years inside that purchase. I will not now turn round and buy you. I will not be the merchant of a knight's cross. I would rather raise the child here in your arms with you ruined than be that. But I will do neither. I will go to Jonzac. The child will go to England. You will keep the cross. You will write to me. You will, when you can, come to wherever I have settled, and I will sit with you and read Racine to you, and, if there are years for it, you will sit with me in a small garden at some distance from Paris, and we will be what we are. He said, Aïssé, what is it you would say to me? He could not for some time say it. He said at length, I have nothing to say to you that you have not anticipated. Yes, you do. What? You wish to ask me what kind of love it is that refuses a sacrifice? Yes. It is the only kind I know how to make. The fire shifted in the grate. The cat watched them. The orchard outside the window was bare and gray with the late winter, and a single small bird, perhaps a wren, hopped twice along the top of the wall and was gone. Aïssé sat down. He sat down on the parlor chair across from her. He put his face in his hands. He did not weep. He was not a man who wept easily. He sat with his face in his hands for some minutes, and Aïssé did not approach him, did not put her hand on his shoulder, did not move from where she was standing by the window. She let him have the minutes. She had known he would need them. When he looked up, he said, Do you know what they will say in Paris about you? In 6 years' time? Yes. They will say that you would not be a duchess in Périgord. They will not understand. No. They will say that you went to Jonzac for the convent's pity, and that you came back to a small house in some provincial town, and that the Chevalier d'Ady kept a Levantine slave mistress on the proceeds of his commandery for 10 years until she died of consumption, and that the daughter was sold to an English merchant in trade. That is what they will say. I have heard them say worse of less. I know. You can bear it. I have borne worse. He stood up. He came across the room. He took her face in his hands. He did not kiss her. He looked at her, the way he had looked at her across the Maréchal's table, with the steady, unflickering attention of a man who has been asked a question and has now been given the answer. He said, Aïssé, you have decided this for both of us, yes. You have decided it without consulting me, yes. I have a right to anger about that, yes, you have. I am not yet sure whether I will exercise the right. You may exercise it whenever you wish, monsieur. I will be at Jonzac for 9 months. You may write me angry letters by post. He laughed once. It was a short, uneven sound, and it took her briefly by surprise. He had not laughed at the supper. He had not laughed in the carriage. He had not laughed in the 4 months between. He laughed once, in the parlor at Auteuil, on the 13th of February, 1721, and the laugh was the thing she remembered, afterwards, more clearly than anything else either of them said. He said, I will write to you. I will write twice a week. The convent porter at Jonzac will be paid by Madame de Fariol to read everything. I am told. He will. He is being paid 4 livres a month. I shall have to invent a code. Use Racine, yes. He kissed her then, on the forehead, the way a husband kisses a wife who has been ill and is recovering. And then he turned and went to the window and stood there with his hand on the sill for the rest of the afternoon. Aïssé sat by the fire and read Madame de Sévigné's letters to her daughter without taking in a word. The story did, of course, leak. Stories of this kind always leak. The secretary of Madame de Ferriol, an abbé called Dubreuil, who had been with the family for 9 years, and who had, in the late autumn of 1720, found himself owed 3 months of salary by a notoriously slow-paying mistress, made arrangements at the end of February with the editor of a manuscript newsletter sent twice monthly to subscribers in Versailles and the principal provincial cities. The newsletter editor was the kind of man who paid for items in the right currency. The Abbé Dubreuil received, in exchange for 2 paragraphs about a young foreign protégé of a deceased Levantine ambassador and a Knight of the Order of Malta, the sum of 200 livres, which represented 1/3 of his arrears. The 2 paragraphs appeared on the 7th of March. They named no names directly. They named Madame de Ferriol's household. They named the order. They named the Saintonge as the destination. They referred to the young foreigner as Mademoiselle A. They did not mention pregnancy. They did, however, refer to the journey south as having been taken for reasons the Maréchal de Villars had had occasion to anticipate, since the autumn supper at which the introduction was first made. The Maréchal read the paragraphs at her writing desk on the morning of the 7th, set down her cup of chocolate, and said, very quietly, to her companion of the bedchamber, "Send for the Abbé Dubreuil." The Maréchal did not send for the Abbé Dubreuil. She sent, instead, a footman to the Rue Vivienne, asking that Madame Calandrini might do her the kindness of paying a call at her earliest convenience. Madame Calandrini came that afternoon. The 2 women sat in the small cabinet of the Maréchal's hotel for an hour, drinking tea, and did not raise their voices. At the end of the hour, Madame Calandrini went home and wrote a long letter to Aïssé, who was by then 4 days into the journey south, sleeping in country inns along the Bordeaux road, with Jasmine keeping watch in the corridor. The Maréchal gave a small supper of farewell that evening. She did not, of course, give it for Aïssé, who was not present. She gave it under the pretext of a thanksgiving for the recovery of her own minor illness. 12 people were at table. The Cardinal de Polignac was there. He came up to Madame Calandrini in the salon afterwards. He stood for some moments looking at her without speaking, and then he said, "Madame, tell Mademoiselle Aïssé from me, when she is in a position to read the message, that the world will say what it will say, and that those of us who knew her in this house will say something else. Tell her that I, personally, will be obliged to her if she will not despair." Madame Calandrini bowed. "I shall tell her, Your Eminence." The Maréchal herself came to Madame Calandrini at the door and put her hand on her arm and said, very low, the one sentence that Aïssé, when she received the letter 8 days later in a roadside inn near Angoulême, would read 3 times, and then fold and put inside the lining of the small traveling Bible that the Cardinal de Polignac had once given her. The Maréchal said, "If the deities push him to renounce the cross now, my dear, he will die in 5 years, and your young friend will be a beggar with no dowry returned. Do not let him." The daughter was born on the 29th of May in 1721, in the small infirmary of the convent at Jonzac in the Saintonge, in a room with a single barred window that looked out on a kitchen garden of cabbages and a low wall, and beyond the wall, a stand of poplars. The labor took 11 hours. The midwife was an elderly lay sister who had been bringing babies into the world at the convent since she was 19, and who did not, on principle, ask the names of the fathers. The child was a girl, healthy, with a fine, pale fuzz of red hair that one of the younger sisters, who had grown up on a farm in the Auvergne, said would darken to copper by her first birthday. Aïssé held her for an hour. She did not give her a name. The lay sister wrote in the convent's book, under the date, in the very narrow column reserved for cases of this kind, "A female child, May 29th, to a young foreign gentlewoman, the father unknown to this house, the placement made by private treaty out of the order's responsibility." The English coach met the convent porter at Calais on the 11th of June. The wife of Henry St. John, Viscount Bolingbroke, attainted of treason by the Parliament of England in 1715, and exiled in France for the past 6 years, took the wrapped child from the porter at the harbormaster's office and carried her into the inn, and waited for the packet boat with her own waiting maid beside her. She wrote to Madame Calandrini that night from the inn. The letter survives. She had not, she wrote, expected the child to be so small. She had not expected the red hair. She had not expected to weep when the porter put the child into her arms. She had been a Frenchwoman for 40-some years and the wife of an English statesman for 10, and she had not, since the third of her 3 miscarriages in 1716, expected to be a mother by any means whatever. The child, she said, would be called Céline, after the Viscount's late mother, and after a name Aïssé had asked the foster parents to choose freely. She would be raised at the Bolingbroke's rented house at La Source near Orleans for the first 3 years, since the Viscount could not yet return to England, and thereafter, when the political weather of London permitted, in England. She would be told nothing of her origin until she came of age. She would not be told even then, unless the foster mother thought it kind to tell her. Aïssé did not learn the name of the child for 6 weeks. The letter from Madame Calandrini reached her at Jonzac on the 3rd of August. By the 3rd of August she had recovered, the lay sister said, as far as a woman in her condition could expect to recover, and the matter of her chest had begun to be plain. The Dr. Bouvard had been right, in February. The matter of her chest was a thing not now to be undone. She had, she calculated, perhaps 8 years, perhaps 5, perhaps less. She read the letter from Madame Calandrini twice. The name, when she came to it, did not surprise her. She had asked Madame Calandrini to ask the Bolingbroks to choose a French name, since the child would be growing up in France first, and a French name in their household would draw less notice when the time came for an English one. Elizabeth was the name Aïssé herself had carried since the convent at Auteuil, since the morning the sisters had baptized her at 6 years old, with the Comte for her godfather and the Abbess of Auteuil for her godmother, and Jasmine standing beside her, holding her small hand, because she had been frightened of the water. The child's name belonged to the Viscount's late mother. Aïssé folded the letter and laid it inside the small traveling Bible that the Cardinal de Polignac had given her, beside the letter from the Maréchal de Villars about the cross. She wrote that evening to the Chevalier d'Ailly, in a code they had agreed upon at Auteuil in February. The code was indeed based on Racine. They had taken the Berenice and assigned to each act and scene a number, and to certain words a positional reference within the scene, and they had written each other now since March with the simple cover that they were 2 private subscribers exchanging a literary appreciation of the play. The convent porter at Jonzac, who was being paid 4 livres a month by Madame de Ferriol to read Aïssé's letters, read 3 of these exchanges with great care, and reported to Madame de Ferriol that Mademoiselle Aïssé had taken to a sort of devotional reading of Racine, that nothing improper had passed under his eye, and that he proposed to continue his report monthly. Madame de Ferriol read his reports and was satisfied. She had not, after all, the patience to read Racine herself, even in support of an interception. The letter of the 3rd of August said, in the code, "She is small and red-haired. She is at La Source. Her name is the saint's name in 2 parts. She will not know us. I am content." She was not, of course, content. She was as content as a woman in her position can be when she has chosen a thing in February that becomes, in the morning of the 3rd of August, a thing she has done. The Chevalier d'Ailly replied, in his own version of the code, on the 8th of August. He said, "I have been reading the Berenice again. I find Titus more honorable than I had remembered. I think you have made him so for me." The Comte de Ferriol lingered longer than the Dr. Bouvard had supposed in February. He died at last on the 26th of October, 1722, 20 months after the doctor's estimate, of an apoplexy in his bedchamber on the 3rd floor of the hotel on the Rue Neuve Saint-Augustin, with Jasmine holding his hand and Madame de Ferriol standing at the window with her back to the bed. He had asked, in his last hour, to have read to him a letter from Aïssé from Sens, where she was attending a sick friend. Madame de Ferriol had read him a letter she had written herself the previous evening in Aïssé's hand, with which she had been familiar for 20 years, and which she could imitate to a degree which had cost her, in the writing, some 4 drafts. The letter described autumn weather in Sens and a friend recovering. The Comte had listened, with his eyes closed. When the letter was done, he had said, "She is happy?" And Madame de Ferriol had said, "She is content, monsieur." And the Comte had nodded and had not opened his eyes again. The will, when read, stood. The annuity of 400 livres for the life of Mademoiselle Aïssé stood. The 500 volumes stood. Madame de Ferriol did not attempt the codicil. She had, by April, no further need of it. She had Aïssé in the Saintonge, and she had the child in Calais, and she had the Chevalier d'Aidi in Toulouse, and the household on the Rue Neuve Saint-Augustin was hers, and she settled into it with the patient satisfaction of a woman whose long campaign had ended in a quiet and complete victory. She did not, however, live very long to enjoy it. She died of a chest fever in the winter of 1723 at the age of 55, in the same bedroom in which the Comte had died, with the same Mariette holding her hand. She left no children. The hotel passed by remainder to a Ferriol cousin in the army, who sold it within the year. Mariette, by a small bequest, went to Geneva and joined the household of Madame Calandrini. Aïssé returned to Paris in the autumn of 1723, to a small set of rooms on the Rue Saint-Roch, which Madame Calandrini had taken in her name and furnished modestly. She set up a household of two, a cook, who had been with the Calandrinis previously, and a manservant who was Jasmine himself, made free by the Comte's will and who had asked for the position. The Chevalier d'Aidi kept the commandery at Toulouse. He sent her a portion of his income each quarter, and he came to Paris in the spring and autumn and stayed in lodgings of his own, taking on the Rue Saint-Honoré. And they walked in the Tuileries gardens in the late afternoon and dined in private at her rooms. And she read to him from Racine in the evenings. And they did not, as far as Madame Calandrini in Geneva could ever afterwards determine, conduct themselves once more in any way that the order would have had occasion to investigate. They were what they had become, a knight on furlough, an Levantine Frenchwoman in a small apartment, and the persons they had each chosen in February 1721. She wrote to Madame Calandrini almost weekly for 10 years. The letters were preserved by Madame Calandrini, who outlived Aïssé by 20 years, and who kept them in a tin box in her cabinet at Geneva. They were first published from the manuscripts in 1787, with notes that the trade ascribed to Voltaire, and reissued at Lausanne the following year. They were read in Paris, and they were read in London, and they were read, eventually, by a woman in Norfolk, who recognized in the description of the small red-haired baby of May 1721 the early childhood of her own mother, who had married a Vicomte de Nantiat, and had been told late in life by Lady Bolingbroke's heirs the bare facts of her origin and the name of her mother. The woman in Norfolk, who was Aïssé's granddaughter, wrote in 1793 to the publisher and obtained a copy. She read the letters. She kept the copy in her library at Holcombe. She died in 1830, having never told her own children that they were the great-grandchildren of a Levantine slave girl, bought at 4 at the Avret Bazaar Market, and a knight of Malta who had not broken his cross. The Grand Chapter of the Order of Malta gave, in 1730, under a new Grand Master who was more accommodating than Zondadari, a circular dispensation for marriage to younger sons of small commanderies who had given 15 years of canonical service. The Chevalier d'Aidi became eligible. The dispensation required a single petition and the payment of 3 years' commandarial income, which was 9,000 livres, which he had, at last, saved. He came to her in the rooms on the Rue Saint-Roch in February 1731 with the printed text of the dispensation in his pocket. He told her. He laid the dispensation on the small table between them. He asked her, formally, what she wished him to do with it. She was 37. She had been ill for 8 years and bedridden for 2 periods, the second of which had ended only 6 weeks earlier. She weighed, she calculated, no more than what she had weighed at 20. Her hair, which had been black, was streaked at the temples with the gray she had inherited from a mother she could not now recall. She sat in the high-backed chair beside the fire and looked at the man across from her, the man who had ridden from Toulouse on the 17th of October, 1720, to ask a baillie of 70 what the rate of the dispensation was, and she did not, immediately, answer. He said, Aïssé. Yes, I have brought it to you because the choice is yours. It has always been yours. It has. Tell me. She said, Monsieur, I will not give you a widowing for your sacrifice. He understood her at once. She had known he would. They had been at this point in the conversation 11 years, and they had each, by now, the precise vocabulary for it. He said, How long does the doctor give you? The Dr. Bouvard, who I do not trust on the question, gives me 2 years. Dr. Silva, who I do trust, gives me 1. I think I have less. And you propose that we go on as we have gone on? Yes. And the dispensation, you wish me to refuse. I wish you to do whatever you wish to do with the dispensation. I am telling you that I will not stand in the chapel and let you pin a cross on yourself, you understand? The cross of a wife of 3 months and then a widower of 40. I will not. Not because I do not love you. Because I love you in the kind of way that does not require it. You knew that in February 1721. You have known it for 10 years. He laid the dispensation on the fire. He did it without theatricality, with the same steady gesture with which she had once seen him refold a handkerchief at the Marechal's supper, and the printed paper curled at the edges and caught, and was gone in a quick yellow flame and a little soot upon the andiron. He said, "There, I have settled the question on my own account. You will regret it. I have spent 11 years not regretting things that would, by the world's reckoning, be regretted. I shall manage another 2. I shall manage 1. I shall manage whatever there is to manage." He sat down across from her. He took her hand. They sat in the small parlor on the Rue Saint-Roch for the better part of an hour without speaking, while the fire shifted in the grate, and Jasmine came in once with tea and went out again without setting it down, because he had seen that they were holding hands and that her eyes were closed. She died on the 14th of March, 1733, at 39, somewhat earlier than even Dr. Silva had predicted, somewhat earlier than she had let the Chevalier d'Aïssé believe. She died in her bed in the Rue Saint-Roch, with him beside her, and Jasmine at the foot of the bed, and Madame Calandrini, who had come from Geneva on the 1st of March on a hard-driven post-chaise, holding her other hand. She did not speak for the last day. On the morning of the 14th, she opened her eyes once, looked at the Chevalier d'Aïssé, and said, in a voice that they had to lean down to hear, "Garde la croix." He nodded. He said, "Je la garde." She was buried at Saint-Roch, in a side chapel, in a plain coffin. The Maréchal de Villars attended the funeral, and the Cardinal de Polignac, who had himself less than a decade to live and who came on his physician's strong dissuasion. Voltaire was in England and did not know of her death until October. He wrote, when he did know, a private note to Madame Calandrini, saying that there had been in Aïssé a quality of which he had spoken once with her at Madame du Deffand's salon, and which he did not feel he had at the time honored sufficiently with his words. The note is preserved. Her estate was small. The 400 livres of annuity died with her. The 500 volumes of the Comte's books were sold, and the proceeds, 2,043 livres, were divided as she had directed in her will of October 1732. Half went, through the Bolingbroke's lawyer in Calais, in trust for her daughter against the day of the daughter's marriage, which by the family record came some years later to the young Vicomte de Nantiat, with no explanation of the source. The other half went to Madame Calandrini, with the direction that she should, at her own discretion, do good for one Levantine slave child in Paris, if there is one to be found, who is in the position I was in at 4. Madame Calandrini, who outlived the bequest by 20 years, used the 1,000 livres in 1737 to purchase the freedom of a small Circassian girl named Halim from a private household in the Rue de Richelieu, and to place her in the convent at Auteuil, where Aïssé herself had been placed in 1798. 1698, that is, I have caught the slip, the years run together, for a Catholic education in a French settlement. The Chevalier d'Aïssé kept the cross. He kept the commandery at Toulouse. He held a small office in the order's Paris house under successive grand priors, and was, by all accounts, scrupulous in his duties. He never married. He kept on his finger for the rest of his life a plain gold ring into the band of which a small black braid of Aïssé's hair, given to him on the morning of the 13th of March, 1733 by Madame Calandrini, had been set under a flat crystal. He died at Périgord in 1761, at 71. He had outlived his brother, Antoine the nephew, and the nephew's first son. By a small irony of inheritance, the estate of 80 did come to him in 1754. He refused it, and it passed to a second cousin. He kept the commandery. He kept the cross. He is buried in the old church at 80. The slab gives his name and his date and the cross of the order. There is no other inscription. The daughter, Céline de Nantiade, lived to 78 and died at her chateau in Provence in 1810. She had 4 children. Her granddaughter in Norfolk, who I have mentioned, read the Lausanne letters in 1793. Her great-grandchildren never knew. The pomegranate seal, the small oval that the Comte had cut for Aïssé in Marseille when she was 11, descended through Madame Calandrini's heirs to a Genevan pastor, and from him to a private collector, and is now in the Bibliothèque de Genève, in a small velvet-lined box in the case marked Manuscript Supplement 47. I have seen it. It is the size of the nail of a small finger. The pomegranate is half open. 6 seeds are visible. Madame de Sévigné, whom Aïssé had been reading on the morning of the 11th of February, 1721, when Madame de Ferriol came into the green drawing-room without knocking, wrote once to her daughter, the Comtesse de Grignan, about a woman of their acquaintance who had decided a difficult thing for the right reason. That such a woman, she observed, is not easily argued out of it by people who have decided easier things for any reason at all. The observation, of course, was not made about Aïssé. Madame de Sévigné had died long before Aïssé was old enough to read her. But the line, in the small literature that grew up around the 18th century editions of Aïssé's letters, has been quoted in connection with her more often than in connection with almost any other woman of the period. The hotel on the Rue Neuve Saint-Augustin was pulled down in 1868 to make way for an extension of the boulevard. The cottage at Auteuil was lost in the same decade. The Rue Saint-Roch's small apartment is now a milliner's premises. Saint-Roch Church